All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to the show. And I'm so happy to welcome back to the program, of course, the great Professor Robert O. Gjerdingen. He is the author of the 2007 Music in the Galant Style and 2020's Child Composers, How Orphans Became Elite Musicians. And today's a very special Christmassy episode. I was thinking of calling it a Christmas schema episode. And one reason why I wanted to focus specifically on music schema is I think over the past couple of interviews, we've had a sort of blend, mainly focusing on Partimento, with a little bit of schema thrown in here and there. But in this episode, I actually really just want to focus on music schema theory, and who better than the person who wrote the book on it? And so this is going to be very interesting because I think a lot of people, when they get very excited into Partimento and they buy all the books and they're not quite sure, is music schema Partimento, is Partimento music schema? You're so deeply entwined with the explosion really of the new movement in the 21st century. So perhaps you could explain to someone who's new to this, is music schema, it may seem ridiculous to insiders, but this question does need to be explained to people very new to this. What is the relationship of music schema to Partimento? Are they the same thing, or is there a difference? And what is the definition of music schema theory? Oh, I'm sorry, and I didn't say hello. I didn't give you a chance to say hello.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, yes.
Sort of Nordic today, so it's freezing cold here.
Oh,
I assume that Singapore is more of a humane climate. Anyway, some background. I was struck as a graduate student by lots of theories of how music works. There was Heinrich Schenker. There was one of my own teachers, Leonard Meyer, talking about expectations and archetypes, what he called archetypes. I was very intrigued by that. And as I read these various authors, it occurred to me that they were talking oftentimes about what a psychologist would call a schema. Now, there's nothing special about that name. You could call it a mental representation or a thing, an idea. When humans walk into a room and they see a chair, they see a chair. They see a category of things that they have learned. They don't look at a chair and say, I wonder what that is. There are 4 vertical elements, and then there's a horizontal element, and then there's some more vertical elements. And I wonder what a person could do with such a thing. That's not how we think. Okay. we are programmed to make summary abstractions of things that we experience in the world when they are similar to each other. We can't help ourselves. I mean, on the downside, this creates stereotypes. But stereotypes are how we navigate the world. I mean, they aren't all bad. So knowing that something is a chair, for example. A famous case is that, in English, the indefinite article is for something that, there could be such a thing. And the definite article is for, yes, there is such a thing. Okay. Well, in the so-called restaurant script, a person will say, I entered the restaurant and told the waiter. And you use the definite article because the moment you say enter a restaurant, your mind has already plugged in all the slots that belong in that schema. And there's a waiter there or waitress or whatever. It's not a waiter, it's the waiter. because the waiter is already in that slot. Anyway, this seemed to help get over some of the problems in music theory. Well, let me put it this way. Music happens in human brains. It doesn't happen elsewhere. Okay. So if you want to understand music, understanding human brains is an advantage. Like I said, similarity sort of drives how the brain works. You know, there's a lot of talk now about artificial intelligence.
Mm.
And I and others made computer models of neural networks 40 years ago now.
No
More than
kidding.
40,
Wow.
more than 40 years ago. I mean, these were simple things. These were done on small personal computers. And any iPhone today would be like a supercomputer 40 years ago. But these early articles did point out that similarity is like the currency of brain computation. Neural circuits just naturally are able to detect similarity very efficiently. And that helps, you know, in terms of music theory. When you're talking about categories of musical patterns, they're never exactly the same. Every piece, you know, it's a different piece because it's slightly different. And the patterns in it are often slightly different. But on the other hand, there are similarities. And this is a sort of a gray scale, you know, it's not black or white. But, let's take, you know, some of these schemas were taught in Naples in the old conservatories. I mean, they just out and out taught them in the way that if you're going to a school that teaches jazz, they're going to teach 2-5-1 progressions. They couldn't not do that. Okay.
So, like for
Because-
instance, a Romanesca was a term. Do you think they would have used?
Oh yes, they called it down a fourth, up a step. Okay, and since this is the Christmas period, Christmas season. Romanesca again. Or another schema would be up a fourth, down a third. Josef Riepel in Regensburg in Germany called this a monte, going up a mountain. Okay. So, Christmas music is a repository of old patterns that have been handed down through the generations. And it's not surprising that the Monte and the Romanesca find their place. Okay. I think it's fair to say that when a 8-year-old Neapolitan orphan went to a harpsichord and went, that they were doing more or less the same thing that Riepel's students were doing in Regensburg, or that somebody might do today, doing the same thing. Now, everybody might do it slightly differently, but as humans, we recognize the similarity. Okay. And of course, in 18th century music, oftentimes they exaggerated the similarity. They made sure that things rhymed and that they were in the same metrical position. Now, in terms of the history of how this scholarly work went together, I will say that music in the Galant style had no Partimenti in it originally. Not a single one. because it was based on a corpus analysis. It was based on what are the regularities in this repertory of music. But then I went to Naples and I found these manuscripts, and they were full of, of these patterns. And, it would just knock me over that, wow, they were teaching this. It wasn't implicit, it was explicit. They were teaching these kids how to survive by, just telling them what the central patterns were. So I came home, and my wife was forced to hear stories about all this stuff. And she was the one, she said, "You've got to put this in the book." And so I did, because for many of the schemas that I was talking about, which again are just categories of or categorizations of the most common patterns in 18th century music, there was a corresponding passage in a Partimento for almost all of them. So I think she had really good sense to insist on that, because I think if Music in the Galant Style had been published without the Partimento part, people would have said, "Yeah, well, yeah, maybe you say that, but maybe I don't say that." But the Partimento material, it was historical. It was real. That there were thousands of Italian little boys who studied this stuff and carried it all over Europe, carried it to the New World, carried it to Mexico City, to South America, to the Amazon. I mean, this stuff went everywhere. So,
Bob, I don't want to interrupt you, but I just wanted to jump in with a very quick question, and I want you to continue, which is,
well, I was going on. You were right to jump
no.
in.
I actually want to speak as little as possible in this interview, but I wanted to ask question, which is, what is the dictionary definition of music schema theory? So, if, for instance, you open up the Harvard Dictionary of Music or Grove, and you see the entry for music schema theory, what should be that definition?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I've never tried to write such a thing. I mean, I will say that, the Harvard Dictionary of Music, when I was studying in the university, did not have an entry for Partimento.
Yes.
So I had 8,000 other entries, but Partimento didn't exist. And I'm sure the same is true for schema. I think a reasonable definition of a musical schema, as opposed to schema theory, for schema theory, you could just say, well, read some of my books or things by Giorgio Sanguinetti or Peter Van Tour, things like that. But and many younger scholars, Nathaniel Mitchell, Gilad Rabinovich, et cetera, et cetera. A musical schema, I would say, is an abstraction of or a naming of a regularity in a musical repertory. So, 2-5-1 in jazz is a schema. Less so in 18th century classical music. So whatever occurs with regularity that would go beyond what you would expect. This is the way collocations, for example, are defined in linguistics. So you have a word like disaster, and then you have a word like, or a short phrase, waiting to happen. In the context of it's a blank waiting to happen, disaster occurs far more frequently than disaster occurs regularly in English. Okay. So the linkage between the context and that particular word is very, very high. And so it rates pointing out as calling it a collocation. Okay? Or sometimes it's called a collostruction. Well, in the same way, in music, certain events happen together far more frequently than you would expect, given the overall statistics. I'll give you a quick example. If you take a harmony class in the US, one of the few things you may remember after a year or two is that 4 goes to 5. Okay. Even though, technically speaking, it hardly ever does. Because you'd have parallel, right? But people are speaking generally. They mean, 4 going to 5, 7, or something else. But anyway, that's what you might learn. But if you counted things in 18th century music, you would find that 4 in C major, with great regularity, goes to 1/6. And in fact, it's almost a lock that it's going to do that in certain situations. So sort of like the word disaster in the context of it's a blank waiting to happen. That 1/6 chord following the 4, that is so common and such a collocation of events that, I called 4 events a printer. It's related to other patterns like the double cadence, et cetera, et cetera. But it turns out, based on James Simmons' statistical analysis of 18th century music, it's, I think, the second or third most common pattern in the entire repertoire.
Wow.
So if one didn't take a theory course, but instead just studied Mozart, okay, the answer would be that 4 goes to 1/6 when it's in a printer. You see, Roman numeral, if there is a theory of Roman numerals, and I don't think there is really, but if there were, it would be based on global statistics. Okay. But that's really a fallacy. People pay attention to local statistics, to the statistics within contexts, rather than to the global whatever. In English, H follows T with fairly high probability. All the words like the and that and this and those, whatever. But when someone says a stitch in time saves 9, they're never tempted to put an H after the T in time. It wouldn't occur to them to do it. Because in that context, H after T is impossible. But globally, H after T is highly probable.
Didn't you have a very good analogy of collecting useless data with like traffic lights or something like that?
Oh, I don't know. I hope I did, but I don't remember it.
It had something to do with if you sat down and just watched traffic lights. Or
yes. This brings us to harmonic functions.
Okay.
There's 3 harmonic functions, according to Hugo Riemann. And, the idea is that the play of these 3 harmonic functions is somehow aesthetic and beautiful and making musical masterpieces. But instead of chords, what if we were talking about 3 lights on the traffic signal? Yellow, red, and green. And we move them around. We turn them on and off at the speed of an allegro movement by Handel. And so the lights would go green, red, yellow, red, yellow, red, green, yellow, green, red, green. And we would watch that for a half hour. And, if it's true in music, it ought to be true in vision. So would we be inspired? Would this be like listening to the Messiah? I don't think so. It's a very strange and peculiar idea, that
that reminds me of a neo-Romanian. There was a sort of graphical representation of I think it was Neo-Romanian, and I'm not sure what it was. It was sort of like a tonets or something. I'm not sure if that was but again, it's the same sort of thing. If we work it all out and we have this wonderful graphical representation, it must mean something, and it's going to be very useful for us if we have this visual thing. But I don't think it quite worked the way that it. I don't think it really was as useful as it claims to be.
No. Well, I don't know. Do we have time for a little digression on harmonic functions?
Well, actually, it kind of really ties into schema, I think, because really, one question I was going to ask you, I only really want to ask you a couple and then bring it to the audience, because the audience brought in a tremendous amount of questions. So I wanted to be less about me. But yes, one of the few questions I had was, is schema theory and scale degrees, are they, in your mind, or a replacement for Roman numerals and harmonic function theory? Or some people really like schema theory, but they think, oh, I want to take what I like from that and merge it with Roman numerals, or I want to, or do you envision just a complete clean wipe in terms of utilization of schema theory? What do you see in this regard? Because obviously the most dominant form of harmonic instruction today is Roman numerals and functions. We in most harmony textbooks, in typical music, if you go on YouTube and type in music theory, that's probably the first thing you will see: Roman numerals and functions. So that's my question to you.
Yes. We're trained in classes to, buy into a certain description of things. Based on, I taught my first harmony class in 1970. That's 54 years ago. And,
Wow.
I have given graduate placement exams in harmony for decades. And I think it's fair to say that people don't learn much in those courses. Given a summer off or a couple years off, they don't remember much of anything, which has always led me to believe that they didn't learn much in the first place, or at least not much that mattered to them. At Northwestern University, one of the cool things about the music school is that traditionally a lot of the studio teachers are members of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, which is to say they are members of the performing super elite. If you're a member of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra on any instrument, you don't need to say anything else about the person's qualifications. Okay. There's no other story that you are among the greatest that there is. I've never heard anybody in that orchestra mention a Roman numeral in 25 years. It's not part of their world. Although I think most of them had something like that in college. But it's not how they describe music. It's not how they talk about it. Well, now some could argue that just the situation didn't come up in which they would proudly talk about a third inversion 3 chord. There could be such, and I just missed it. Um, yeah, I think, well, seriously, I've been thinking about theory classes and theory itself. I think the mismatch that people are feeling today has to do actually with European and American uh, ideas of social class. And that may sound kind of far out, but it's worth remembering that, as Winston Churchill once said, that higher education was for well-to-do citizens. You know, in his day, only the upper classes went to the university, or very earnest and scholarly middle-class kids. But it was a small percentage of the population. It was mostly for men, and they were considered gentlemen. So, for example, in the realm of sports, gentlemen only competed against other gentlemen. And if you had worked with your hands for money, manual labor, you were not eligible. It's hard to believe today. But I don't know if you remember Grace Kelly. She was the queen of
Movie
Hollywood.
actress.
Yeah, she married Prince Rainier of Monaco. Her father was a rower, you know, like at Oxford and Cambridge kind of rower. He had worked as a bricklayer as a child, and he later became a very wealthy construction baron in the city of Philadelphia. Yes, and he had one of the most beautiful daughters that ever lived. Anyway, the Henley Regatta in England is the like the Olympics for rowing. He was not allowed to enter the Henley Regatta because he had once worked with his hands.
And he
Uh,
was a wealthy person.
yes, Jim Thorpe, the greatest athlete of the 20th century, perhaps, was an American Indian. And he was stripped of his Olympic medals because he had played semi-pro baseball one summer. If you've ever seen the movie The Bridge on the River Kwai,
Right, with Alec Guinness.
yes, the plot of that movie hinges on the fact that the officers refused to do manual labor because they were
Yes.
gentle. And in fact, that is written into the Geneva Convention, believe it or not.
Right.
Gentlemen cannot be required to do manual labor. All right, so now we switch to Europe. Traditionally, musicians are in the artisan class. You know, pianists literally do manual labor. But it's true. Artisans could go to a conservatory, which was a trade school, really, but they could not go to the university. It's hard to think of any 19th century famous composers who went to a university. There must have been some, but I can't think of any.
Now
They were in
you're
the
contrasting university with conservatory because they were
yes,
the conservatories back in the day.
yes. And in Europe, they're still very, very separate. So when it came time in the United States in the early 20th century to set up music departments, the idea was that a university or college music department would not do so-called applied music. So a music department would not teach lessons. It would not teach counterpoint or something like that. In the same way that a geology department would not teach mining or oil drilling. Okay. That was for workers. So the idea was that a music department, and this was explicit. I mean, a fellow named Archibald Davison at Harvard wrote about this in the 1920s, that conservatory style education did not belong in a university, and instead it should be based on the theory and history of music.
Mm.
Now, the theory side was so-called science of harmony. But in truth, the science was aspirational. It wasn't actual.
Aspirational.
It was. Okay. Now here's where I have to get a little bit nerdy and talk about
Please
Thomas
do.
Young. Thomas Young was one of the great geniuses of 19th century science, but died in his mid-20s. So think of him as a kind of science Mozart. I mean, just a towering genius without any special instruments or techniques. He thought about color vision. How do humans perceive color? And he made a hypothesis. He said, I think it's possible if they're able to perceive 3 separate colors, and then you can derive all the other colors from that. This was a brilliant hypothesis. I mean, it just came out of nowhere. Now, he died in 1829, maybe, in that area. His hypothesis was 1802. In the 1850s, Hermann von Helmholtz, who was one of the greatest German scientists, I mean, he was like the 19th century Einstein. He studied human perception, both music and vision. And he took up Jung's theory and proved that it was true. And since he started life as a physiologist, as a kind of anatomist, okay, he and others showed that in the human eye, there actually are little rods and cones that respond to 3 different colors. This is the so-called trichromatic theory of vision. And it's almost enough to explain color vision. You know, there's actually a physical substrate to this. Now, there's also the neural circuitry that comes after that. And part of that is what's called an opponent theory of visual processing. So, for example, if you stare at a kind of blue for a while and then look at a white page of paper, you'll see, I think, orange or red or something like that, but you'll see a kind of opposite color.
Mm.
Okay, so, you know, the whole package of color vision is not simple. I mean, the brain is not simple at all. It's one of the most complex things in the universe. But anyway, Jung and Helmholtz came up with this 3-part, you know, with 3 things, you could have all the colors. And they actually found, not Jung, but later, actually found that physiologically, we have the basis for that in our eyes. So it's really brilliant science when you think about it. It's a little bit like the English neuroscientist named Sherrington, who 130 years ago said there must be something called the synapse that gets close to connecting neurons but doesn't actually touch them. He had no way to see a synapse. They're only a few molecules big. But 60 years later, they determined that, yes, that's actually true. So Sherrington, Jung, these are amazing, you know, really insightful people. Okay, I think, well, Hugo von Riemann read Helmholtz. And also Hauptmann and von Ettingen and other people. And it's usually from that music side of things that we think of Riemann as getting his 3 functions, you know, dominant, subdominant, and tonic in the middle. But I wonder, I don't have any proof for this, but I wonder if Riemann also read Helmholtz on vision. because the idea of the three cardinal colors being able to handle all vision is so similar to the idea of three cardinal harmonies accounting for all of harmony. The difference, unfortunately, for Helmholtz is that there's nothing in the ear that corresponds to the rods and cones with three different frequency sensitivities in the auditory system, to my knowledge. I mean, much is unknown about human perception, but there's no physical evidence of.
It's not like there's a dominant cone and a subdominant
Yeah,
rod in the ear.
exactly. There's nothing like that. And in when you get down right down to it, what Riemann and many other German theorists of harmony were saying is that, well, everything's a cadence. All music is a cadence. The subdominant yearns for the dominant yearns for the tonic, and the tonic yearns for anything else. In terms of aesthetics or the practical behavior of humans, I think it's mostly just fanciful, aspirational science. It's not science at all, really. There are a lot of cadences in music, and there are a lot of phrases that are structured like extended cadences. And so, music has so many patterns in it that if you want to believe that everything's a cadence and every 4 wants to go to a 5 and every 5 wants to go to a 1, you can find evidence for that and you can make yourself happy.
But, okay, so, sorry.
Well, 1 goes to 5, but 5 doesn't go to 1. 6 goes to 3. And most theories of harmony say that doesn't make any sense at all. That's a pattern that everybody knows, and in fact likes if they ever went to a wedding where they play Pachelbel's canon. Okay.
So, but there functions is something that really, I know great musicians. There are some who absolutely swear by it. They think absolutely a function has to exist. The cadence is perhaps proof of that. That the cadence 5-1 is a powerful sensation. Professor Gjerdingen, you were in cognition for a very long time, musical cognition. So isn't that a true thing? I mean, that's a truism, truly, that there's a sort of a resolution, right? When we go from a 5-1, that cannot be denied. So we might get the wording wrong or the description wrong, but that's a thing that exists in nature that we might not call it a function, but it exists.
It exists in our minds. In other words, we recognize the schema, we know where we are in it, and we know what comes next. Now, someone like Schenker, for example, thought that these desires and expectations are in the tones. That they confuse something that's second nature with nature. It's only second nature because we hear it happening time and time and time again. But there's nothing intrinsic about the thing that makes it act in a certain way. Theories of harmony get hung up on saying that chords have meanings outside of any context. If I'm in C, an F chord wants to do something. Okay. But it really doesn't. It's fine as it is. It doesn't give Christmas presents. It doesn't sing carols.
Why does the brain enjoy a cadence so much? Has science ever been able to explain that?
Oh, the satisfaction of expectations does release, chemicals.
But this is almost like a universal thing around. I mean, I'm not sure. Maybe I'm displaying my ignorance, but perhaps in other cultures, do people? I think people enjoy a G chord, so-called, going to a C chord? There's a universal aspect to that, surely.
No.
There isn't. Okay, so you can explain.
No. Well, traditionally, most of the world's cultures didn't use triads at all.
Okay.
They're very, very rare.
Okay, so maybe
Just
you could explain that. Maybe that would be very helpful. Is if that's a so to relate to this idea that things are intrinsic. Perhaps they're not intrinsic at all outside of certain cultures.
yeah, there's a kind of wonderful hubris in European 19th century musicians and people who wrote about music. Remember, at the time, Germany, not so successfully, France, rather successfully, Britain, spectacularly successfully, were grabbing all the real estate in the world. It really was a truthful statement that the sun never set on the British Empire,
Mm.
because wherever the sun was shining, there was something owned by Britain in the vicinity. So the Europeans tended to think of themselves as the master race. We know how bad this can get, but that what they were doing in music was a superior kind of music that the rest of the world would get up along into eventually as they became civilized. Well, I suppose that seemed plausible around 1900, 1910. But of course, they didn't see hip hop coming. Okay.
Well, isn't that not even true in like the Renaissance? Like there's the soprano cadence, there's the alto cadence, there's the tenor cadence, there's different. So it's not necessarily always five that you see that's being used as
Correct.
the cadence.
Correct. So, for example, in the Renaissance, a imperfect consonance expanding by half and whole steps to a perfect consonance was a cadence. So, by the time we get to Bach, that has to be a half cadence. But in the Renaissance, it's just as good a cadence as it's the same
Mm.
cadence. Now, some of those can be interpreted as 5-1, some can't. But it was a melodic art. It was the combination of melodies.
Mm. Okay, so there wasn't this primacy of 5-1. That
No,
didn't. That.
no. Now, Hugo Riemann, again, in his history of music theory, was quite explicit. This is, if you want to call it colonialism in the historical sense. He was quite explicit that even Gregorian chant was based on harmonic functions, but
Wow,
they didn't know it yet. That
that's
they
a
were just
strong claim.
yes. These are universal claims. You see that all of mankind is subject to harmonic functions, all of human history. It's just that most humans were ignorant and unaware of this shining light that German science was going to shine on them and make their lives better. But, for most of the world's people, rhythm and melody are the whole ball game. For most of human history.
Oh,
And harmony of the European type really doesn't come into it uh, until European influence.
right. Okay, Professor Yerdigan. So I have just one quick question, then I'm going to go to the audience questions, which is, can you
Okay.
speak on the concept of fundamental bass in an in-depth way? So, for instance, Mozart described the inversions of a seventh chord to Thomas Atwood in his lessons with him, and you use as a famous example in the child composer's book that the Paris Conservatory used Catel's harmony textbook over Rameau as they selected him. But if you actually look at Catel's textbook, he does speak of inversion. So sh- doesn't that, in a sense, prove that yes, maybe Rameau was right in the end because there are inversions of chords? So what is the big fuss here?
Well, inversions of chords were recognized a century before Rameau. in the 1600s. Again, it's a kind of similarity, if you will. It's just pointing out a similarity. Mozart, for example, really didn't describe the inversions of chords to Atwood. He described how this chord was similar to, and we immediately look on that and say, he's showing an inversion. Okay. But really what he was demonstrating was a similarity. You know, in Italian pedagogy, when you were going to prepare and resolve a 7 to a 6, there were 4 ways to prepare it, and you had to learn each of the 4 ways. And that meant that there were 4 consonances that you could use to prepare the dissonance: 1, 3, 5, 6. We, today might look at that and say, oh, well, those are inversions.
Yep.
But they did not say that, that this version of a chord is an upside down version of that version of a chord. They treated them as separate things. So that doesn't mean that.
Were they ignorant? Perhaps a Riemannian sort of analysis of their pedagogy would be, that's maybe just ignorance there.
No, they weren't.
Or do you think they actually knew it, but they were thinking it's better not to take such a drastic position like that?
Well, it's do you focus on difference that makes a difference to the way you do your art, or do you focus on a kind of abstract similarity? So, for example, if you know a family that has 5 children, you could look at the first child and say, oh, that's the son of my friend. And then you could look at the second child and you could say, that's a version of the son of my friend. And each of the other children are versions of the son of my friend. Now, those children would prefer to be described as things on their own, right? Rather than as versions of the first child, okay? J.S. Bach, according to his son Emmanuel, did not buy the inversion business. For him, every arrangement of tones was separate and required different treatment, So I'm not saying that DFAC is totally different than FACD. But, things like theories of inversions, Roman numerals, they miss a lot. Okay. And even Italian pedagogy can only get so much right. Let's take a Renaissance cadence. Or there's a 7/6 or 2/3 suspension. Okay, now if I harmonize it this way, the bass is going E, F, G, G. I have a tonic chord, a passing tone, and then 2 dominant chords. But if I slow the bass, now I have a subdominant chord and a dominant chord. But it's the same darn thing. Okay. And in fact, in Italian pedagogy, this is a simple cadence. And this is a compound cadence. So you can see when you have multiple voices acting semi-independently in time, trying to pick a single
abstraction
nomenclature, to say what's really going on is not so simple. Hence schemas. Schemas have a range of variation. I mean, these are all, if you will, instantiations or realizations of a basic cadential schema. And it happens to be in the upper parts. which causes a lot of mayhem for Roman numerals or even thoroughways. They have to treat those as almost entirely different things.
Right. Right.
Whereas when we hear them, they're not really different.
Right. Right. Okay, so thank you to my audience for sending in all these questions, and hopefully we can do justice to these questions. So, Professor Gjerdingen, why don't we just start off? And this is a great one because music in the Galant style was released 2007. It's been a while since then. Are there any new schemas that you have discovered lately?
Yes, I haven't written about any of them, but let me describe it as the coast of Norway problem. I think this comes up in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy or something like that. But if you look at a map from a map of all of Norway and draw a pencil, you'll get a length of the coast of Norway. There's a lot of ins and outs of the coast. But if you get closer to it, like maybe 10,000 feet above the coast of Norway, you see now that these fjords, these inlets, themselves have inlets. And now you get down to the ground and you get close to the coast, and you'll see that the inlets have inlets. And the closer you get, the coast of Norway gets longer and longer and longer. And in fact, you can get down to grains of sand and it gets longer and longer and longer. You're going in and out.
That coast looks really tough.
Yeah. So the closer you look, the longer it is. It's the same with schemas. The closer you look, the more you find. Okay. And this is true of any human area of expertise. When if you've never made a table, tables are just tables. But if someone starts making tables, suddenly there's a lot of different kinds of tables. Okay. And the same with schemas. There are more kinds of Romanescas than there are stars in the sky. And same for all these other patterns. I should point out that other scholars who know a lot of 18th and 19th century music have been talking about a variety of new schemas. Nathaniel Mitchell just won the Best Paper Award from the American Musicological Society for a schema called the Volta. And I won't pretend to play it for you, but John Rice, a terrific scholar of 18th century music, someone who knows more 18th century music than I do for sure. He has named quite a number of schemas that aren't mentioned in any of my work. And so there's tons and tons of them. Each, as the list gets longer and longer, they tend to be more particular.
Okay. I'm sure scholars, they send you an email because they almost want to check with the quote unquote pulp of music schema theory. Have I is this a real schema, or am I imagining things, or can I get your blessing on this? So
well, you are highly intuitive, because actually there's a project going on now to your listeners may know that there's a website that I maintain called Partimenti.org. And I put up various manuscripts and things. It's huge. I mean, I would guess that most people have never seen everything on Partimenti.org. You could spend your whole life there. But there will now be a section that will be like the Hall of Fame of schemas. And so if something, I don't know if we're going to have a committee or something, but if something sort of passes the schema test, it'll be mentioned in this schema repository. It's a little bit like, I think there's some place in Northern Europe where in a frozen mountain, they save seeds from all kinds of plants. So we're going to have like in frozen South Dakota where I live, we'll store up all the schemas from past times.
Okay, this is another two-parter. What are the 5 best books on counterpoint that you'd recommend to a modern Partimento enthusiast? And question 2, back in the 80s, you translated Carl Dahlhaus's book on the history of harmonic tonality. How can we merge his ideas with schemata theory?
Okay. Number one, and I don't mean to be perverse, but I would say the 18th century Italian counterpoint treatises at partimenti.org are the best way to study counterpoint for Partimento. Those are the people who did the Partimenti, and they're really interesting treatises. So, let's see. I see you're going there. Cellini, for example. Yeah, there we go. First species, 1 page. Then if you could go to the next page. By the bottom of the second page, we're at second species. And he runs through the species very quickly. Now we're in third species, fourth species. They don't spend a lot of time on that. And it's extensive. All of the exercises you've shown on those pages are based on an ascending and descending hexachord in the bass. But it's a terrific education. And one of the things you'll see is that in those treatises, they really emphasize variation. In other words, you give an upper part, a counterpoint, to the same bass up to 5 to 7 times. And each one has to be different.
Great. And question.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No. The second part of the question.
Carl Dahlhaus, History of Harmonic Tonality.
I think that Dahlhaus was the greatest German musicologist of the 20th century. Now he's everybody likes to argue with Carl Dahlhaus, but he was a giant. He got his first job on the recommendation of Bertolt Brecht, I think. That usually doesn't happen for junior professors. And he wrote about what he called the rise of harmonic tonality. And he actually did not come to a complete conclusion about it. But I thought one of the very interesting points he makes is that he thinks it's contemporaneous with a shift toward meter, toward metrical counterpoint. And if you want to think about it in terms of counterpoint, the biggest difference between Palestrina and Bach, for example, is that in Palestrina, almost all important relationships are note to note. And in Bach, they aren't. They're metrical place to metrical place. That's a huge difference. And I think that's tied with what we think of as tonality today.
Okay. Thoughts on parallelism between Schenker's theories and schema theory, but of course, more broadly, including solfeggio and counterpoint, and if there's anything useful to be learned from the parallels between Schenker and schema theory. For example, the analytic practice of tracing structural notes seems very similar to identifying a melody such like La Sol Fa Mi, the Printer.
I agree. Yes. There's a lot of interesting stuff in Schenker. And a schema analysis of a Mozart piano sonata and a Schenker analysis, one of his analyses, have some overlaps, quite a few. Now, he had, this overarching theory about musical structure that I've never been able to get on that train and take that journey because, for one thing, I don't have absolute pitch. So, 5 minutes into a piece, I could remember what note it started on, but if I'm listening to a recording, there's no such thing as a G sharp for me when I'm listening to a recording when I don't know what the key. There's only relationship. So that's a difference. And then the schemas that I write about can be processed and held in human short-term memory, what's called working memory. Before they're sent to long-term storage. That's the size of the schemas that I've written about. He writes about patterns that cannot be perceived by ordinary people, at least in a psychological experiment. We forget things very quickly and most people are unable to remember 5 minutes in the past, whether the tone they're hearing now is higher or lower than the tone they heard back then. They're quite insensitive to that kind of thing. That's why power ballads in pop music tend to modulate up and never come back down. It's not that they end on a big question mark. It's just that they end where they're supposed to, but it's in a different key than they started with.
It doesn't seem to be much use to go back to the original key after you've went up. It feels like you need to keep going up, I guess.
Yeah. So you see, in that sense, the necessity to have long range tonal unity or whatever is more a belief than anything else. If you look at old opera scores, you'll sometimes, the actual scores that people used in the 19th century, it's very common for singers to transpose the arias. There's a famous Bellini aria called Casta Diva, and it's never sung in the original key, or hardly ever, because the first performer pushed it up a couple of steps and it stuck.
So much for Werk Troya then.
Yes. Again, these are the Ursatz and the Werk Troya. These are kind of they're kind of
aspirational,
mythical.
as you were saying, or just
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. People actually are quite what would you call it? They're quite loose in what they tolerate in terms of tonal design.
Okay, so the next question. I know Professor Gjerdingen studied with Leonard B. Meyer, known for his work on rhythm. Of course, there are regional differences in rhythm, for instance, the French versus the Germans versus the Italians. But in a given time and place in the Baroque period, are there laws for rhythm, and are they as strict as those for counterpoint and harmony? For example, complementary/composite rhythms, starting a phrase on an afterbeat with an anacrusis, shorter note durations. How did rhythmic conventions change moving to the Galant period?
Well, that's a deeper question than I can answer. I did touch upon it with the idea of the Galant really emphasizes discontinuous relationships related by their place in a metric grid. So tatyaram, apyaram, all of those events you can predict out in time, but they're not contiguous. And so, at that time, they distinguished strict counterpoint, which was note-to-note relationships, from what they called free counterpoint. And so the relationships of free counterpoint are central to Galant music. I think a lot of American students have learned a lot from Schenker because he wrote about free counterpoint. And most of those students had never encountered it in a contrapuntal sense outside of a Schenker class. So in some sense, Schenker gets credit for free counterpoint, but it was a standard topic back in the day. Now, the kind of rules that questioner was asking about are much more severe in, let's say, Palestrina, in the sacred style. There, you really can identify rhythmic rules, but I'm not exactly aware in the 17th century how that changes. Carl Dahlhaus called the 17th century the no longer but not yet.
The poor 17th century. I mean, this
Yeah,
it's like this blind spot.
it's hard, and I think most students today don't realize that the 17th century was harmonically much wilder than the 18th century.
Yeah, it
The,
was a
18th,
great century.
the 18th century simplifies 17th century harmony. You know,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Schenker is mentioned again in the next question. Could it be that these schemas contribute to the kinds of prolongations that Schenker later identified in his theories?
well, again, I would say depends on how prolonged. It's funny. Prolongation at the Paris Conservatory was a suspension. You literally prolonged a note. It wasn't, some grand thing. Um, I think it's worth backing up just a little bit and talking about linguistics today, and the idea of levels that are discontinuous, or let's say self-contained. So in linguistics, you have, let's say, at least three levels. You have a level of words, and then you have a level of clauses, including sentences, but sentences are made up of clauses. And then you have a level of discourse, how you put together like a novel or a poem or an oratory. Well, if you think about it, the level of clauses is really separate from the level of words. You can plug in all kinds of different words in a clause in the right slot. Doesn't matter to the clause. It still makes sense. And similarly, the level of discourse, rhetoric and oratory and things like that, you can put any number of clauses in a verse or an oratory, and you can change lots of words without having any effect. Okay. Schenker takes the rather extreme position that each note has, a kind of necessary function in a vast time scale. I don't think that's plausible. But at smaller time scales, I think he's often very astute as to what he pays attention to. So there's a lot to like in Schenker, but from my point of view, he goes to the extremes.
Who is the
Meyer,
music?
Leonard Meyer did this once with his rhythmic theories. At the end of there's a book by Meyer and Grosvenor Cooper. It's about applying metrical feet, poetic feet, like iams and trochees, short long, or weak strong, strong weak, that kind of thing. Well, Meyer then thought maybe that phrases were like that. You could have a weak phrase and a strong phrase, and eventually he went all the way to say like a sonata has, the exposition is a kind of like a weak upbeat, and then there's a development, and it's sort of like weak strong is
Right.
the recapitulation. And I remember talking to him once, and I said, Professor Meyer, he wanted people to call him Lenny, but I couldn't. He was, this august person. I couldn't. I said, Professor Meyer, this just doesn't seem plausible. The whole exposition of something could just be like a little upbeat, And I said, I'm not criticizing, poetic feet and things like that, because, songs get set to music. But I said, I don't know about this. And he said, Bob, he said, It's like you got a sausage grinder, you put the sausage in, and you can't resist just turning the crank. So my personal feeling is that Schenker often just couldn't resist turning the crank, but that some of that stuff is not that useful.
Mm. Who is the music theorist who talked about the will of the tones and that sort of thing?
That's Schenker,
I see.
Tonvilla. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. So, okay, this is one you've answered on the show a few times, which is why did music education deviate from a pattern recognition way of learning, which showed great results? And he uses the analogy of chess players solving tactical positions. Very, very good observation, which can be compared to Partimenti's. Both improve pattern recognition and prepare you for a real situation. In the case of music, improvisation, composition. In chess, when you play the actual game, you're able to spot tactical patterns. So why the deviation in history?
Yes. Why indeed? Oh, horror. Why did we go there? Well, again, I think it's social class that American and European elites did not aspire to be artisans. Like in Germany, a young count going to the university did not want to become a poorly paid musician. He wanted to know what kind of music to tell his musicians to play. Okay. And so he wanted to know about style and kind of harmonic theories and so it's like biology. You don't aspire to be a bacterium. You just want to read about them. Okay. And so musicians were lower class people. Now, the greatest of them became artistes, which was a higher category. But the reason you could have 100 people in a pit orchestra playing for ballet dancers was that they got paid very, very little. Today the problem with ballet is that the orchestra is more expensive than the ballerinas. They get about what an orchestra player gets, but if you need 100 orchestra players, you aren't going to be able to afford 100 ballerinas. I mean, they got paid so poorly that the first chairs at the Paris Opera in the 19th century would hire seconds to do the rehearsals. They would just show up for the gig.
Yeah.
Probably not the performance practice. But no, that was a very excellent question. I think social class explained why, 80 years ago, these changes were made. But I don't think it makes sense for us today.
And what a great treat. Nathaniel Mitchell is here. And he has okay, yeah, so why don't we just jump in? What are the biggest or most interesting unanswered questions for music schema theory in your view?
Well, I think one of the questions was partially answered by James Simmons in his dissertation of 2017 or 18, and that was if you he took Neapolitan solfeggi, which are melody and bass pieces. He took 300 of them and tallied all the patterns that are isochronic, in other words, that come at equal time intervals. And again, that's important because it's not note to note that most of these patterns occur. And sure enough, practically every pattern in music in the Galant style shows up in the top 10 of the statistics. So there's lots more to do there, but I think it's possible. I mean, he was quite sophisticated. This is not just like counting and then taking the average. But I think he did show that, yes, statistically, these are the most common patterns. It wasn't just like a nightmare that I had, and just writing down my fantasies. I think that's one thing. I think another thing that would be quite different would be finding somebody who has learned to recognize these patterns. Let's say an experienced early music player, they might not have to know them as, the names that I've given them or anybody else. But it would be interesting if in brain scans of one type or another, you could show that they were responding to roughly the same kind of on and off of these patterns as they go by in real music. That there are tremendous obstacles to doing that. I mean, for one thing, fMRI scanners, I've been in a couple of them, and it's like being inside an iron foundry. I mean, they're loud, they're
Okay.
scary loud. So
Right.
so listening to a string quartet when you're in this this terrifying environment is a challenge. But
Mm,
anyway, I think that would be a very remarkable development.
okay. Yeah. And there's just I think we should do these follow-up questions here, which is what can music practitioners or theorists stand to gain by paying closer attention to cognitive science? What can cognitive science stand to gain by paying closer attention to musicians on the flip side?
Yes. Well, I would say that cognitive scientists have always had a fondness for music in
Mm,
studies. And going back to Hermann von Helmholtz in the 19th century. Um, and now with digital recordings and manipulations, we can do an awful lot. And people are doing an awful lot. I would say Montreal is probably the center of world study uh, of the cognition of music. Uh, both from the neuroscience side and from the music side. Um, and just, I mean, really, this is my personal feeling, but I think the closer music theory could be to cognitive science, the better off it would be. I really think that music theory should be applicable to any musical style. So if we took that position, which is a radical position, then we're not going to spend a year doing Bach chorales. As beautiful as they are. I mean, they are mother's milk to me. I grew up with them. But I understand that in today's world, they are they are gems from the distant past. And if we are going to have a music theory that is applicable to any style of music, then it has to be more general and focused on listeners and harmony in the broadest sense. Yeah.
They're quite wild, aren't they? The Bach chorales. They're not. They're like they're you. People that he does some very
Yes.
adventurous thing. It's not like Corelli, who is a little bit more like easy, like good for beginners. It's this is Bach is it's
Yes.
like giving a beginner a very difficult thing to start with, actually.
They're challenging because Bach gets handed a 15th century melody, or a part 16th century melody, a couple for 15th, but mostly 16th century melodies, and then harmonizes them for the 1700s. And that's challenging. Some of them don't have leading tones. Um, they're what we might say today modal, although that's
Mm,
kind of anachronistic. But yeah, they're challenging. There are the more galant ones use galant schemas,
mm,
but a lot of them, harken back to. I mean, Bach and Handel were born in the 17th century.
mm.
They were 15 years old when the 18th century began.
Yeah,
So they had already learned their craft.
yeah. Okay, and then the final part of the this series of questions: what are the biggest methodological challenges of theorizing about the cognition of people we can't study in laboratory settings, like historical figures?
Yes. Well,
No
um,
time machines.
no, exactly. I mean, I remember back in the back in the time of cassette tape players. I remember one of my graduate school friends saying, if we just had an 8-track tape of Monteverdi uh, sitting at the organ, we would know more about 17th century music than we would know from from everything else that we've learned. So yes, it's very, very difficult. There's a psychologist of music named Carol Krumhansel, and she did a lot of interesting work on tonality and sort of what's in people's minds. And her strategy was what she called converging evidence. In other words, you try a lot of different things and you hope that the evidence converges on some kind of reasonable interpretation. So for historical figures, we can look at the music that they wrote. We can look at what their teachers taught them. We can look at what they said about what they did. We can look about what other people said about what they did. And hopefully this all converges on a reasonable interpretation. You know, I mean, when music theory only listened to Germans, okay, then Handel and Mozart, for example, were German musicians. They were products of German culture, and whatever they learned, it was German. But today, when we're a little less nationalistic about these things, and especially being Americans, we don't have, there's nothing Norwegian that I can say about Mozart that will enhance anyone's understanding. So I'm kind of neutral in that respect. Now, today, we can see that 14-year-old Mozart is hauled to Italy by his father to see what's going on, that he learns opera writing in Milan, that he studies with the Czech composer Myslivacek, that he goes to Naples and goes to the opera there and goes to the conservatories, and that Handel, to finish his education, goes to Italy. Right? So, this was an international style, but it had strong Italian roots.
Right. Okay. So I think that this would have been good to have answered earlier on, but we can just do a quick revisit of this, which is, what is the difference between schema and structure? Can the schema be individual and dynamic, or is it rather universal and rigid? Can we talk about hyperschema?
I'm not sure what a hyperschema would be, but schemas have structure, no doubt. But if we define schemas in terms of mental representations, in other words, things that are held in long-term memory, that are processed in working memory and transferred to long-term human memory, then they have limitations. And you can make up structures of any kind. I mean, if we think of the history of 20th century avant-garde music, it's a long trail of one-off structures, okay, that somebody thought would be really impressive, but that no one will probably ever hear again in recorded history. Whereas schemas are something capable of being shared. When a group of people has similar musical experiences, my hypothesis is that they develop similar musical schemas. Do, re, mi. In Counterpoint, I don't think it's accidental that every third beginning exercise at the Paris Conservatory, but also especially the Naples Conservatory, involved do, re, mi. They wanted to make sure that all the students shared that experience. Now, I would say, in partial response to Nathaniel's question, there is a leap of faith here that I'm suggesting that listeners pick up on this kind of thing. And whether they can reproduce it or not, that they are sensitive to that it makes sense. They have an understanding of it, in that they can kind of follow where it goes and feel comfortable with it. But I will admit that's a leap of faith. We don't really know what's in most people's minds, or hardly anybody's mind, when it comes to music. We don't really know how music is stored in the brain. I mean, we assume it's stored
Really?
like other things, but a visual pattern is relatively easy to think about because it's, a spatial pattern. Temporal patterns are not so easy to think about because if you think about it, working memory is a dynamical system. Okay, it's electrical impulses flying around neurons and neurons turning on and off, and lots is happening. But when it goes to long-term memory, it becomes physical and it doesn't change. Like when you write something in longhand, your hand moves around and it's dynamic. But when you stop and look at it now, it's an immovable physical pattern of light and dark. So what we don't know, or at least what I don't know, maybe somebody does, there's science moves fast, but how does the dynamic temporal patterns in working memory become fixed patterns in long-term memory? I think that's still a challenging thing in neuroscience.
There's a lot of questions in here, but I think I do want to actually get through all of them. So why don't we just quickly go through them? And I think we've actually, you might have answered them over the course of this interview, but let's just recap so people can get a refresh then. So what is the scope of the schemas, or the concept of schemas itself? Is it universal and systematic, or stylistic and historical, in brackets, hermeneutical?
The latter.
Okay. Number two, how do you explain the perceived and hierarchical unity of tonality? Is there a hierarchy of tonality? I guess this relates to functions.
Yes. Well, I would say it's what people perceive, okay, based on their experiences. I think music theorists tend to oversell tonality. I mean, every time they attempt to define it, then music changes, but it still seems kind of tonal. And so then you keep stretching the definition further out and further out, like, do you need leading tones? No, you don't need leading tones. Well, if you don't have leading tones, how do you know where the tonic is? Well, because, psychologically, there have been some studies that show that whatever tone is at the end of a series of tones tends to sound like the tonic after a while, if it repeatedly comes at the end. And it almost doesn't matter which tone it is.
Yeah.
So we pick up on, some of this, some of the things we say about tonality are kind of self-referential. In other words, we assume that there is something called tonality. It's worth pointing out that it's a very recent concept. It's only from the early 19th century. Okay, it was not a concept in the world of Mozart or Bach. The Feti, the Belgian, the director of the Belgian Conservatory and a Paris music critic, he claimed that he discovered it. He said it was like a moment, like Paul on the road to Tarsus
Damascus?
or whatever. Yeah. He said the false doctrines flew in pieces all around me, and tonality.
The errors were
yeah.
Okay.
Definitely a psychological quality. It's not in the music itself.
I asked you this earlier, actually. So, is your theory a pedagogy for another third-party systematic theory, like something like a plug-in almost, or is it a systematic theory and a pedagogy all in itself?
Well, I would say what is a person's goal? If the goal is to be able to function like an 18th century musician, then Partimenti and Solfeggi, whatever, it's the only way to go. But if the goal is broader than that, then things would have to be different. If it's jazz pedagogy, I mean, if you think about it, jazz pedagogy is a lot like Partimenti.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of Partimenti, you have lead sheets. Instead of solfeggi, you have tunes.
Mm.
And, you work practically in an applied way with those tools.
Mm.
So, yeah, I think, well, I should say, I don't think there's a universal musical pedagogy.
Mm.
I think it's style specific.
It's regarding jazz, Professor Gjerdingen. Did you ever hear that? I don't know if I ever told you this, but there was a very famous jazz teacher, Barry Harris, who passed away very recently. It was in his 90s, I think. Very like, and also very like he hated anything that wasn't bebop. So he was a very strict traditionalist, and
I,
he absolutely despised like modern jazz theory. He hated it so much. And there was a little girl, I think you know who she is. She trained in Partimenti. She actually attended one of his master classes, and she blew him away basically. And he
oh,
actually, in the middle of the class, by the way, this guy hates modern jazz theory. He's very opinionated. He turned to the class and he said, "Everything this little girl is doing is correct," and that's the word he used.
yeah, I still teach that little girl. I do, and she can do things that I can't do now. And she's only 10 or 11, or I forget exactly what. But yeah, I would say that if a person can, we're talking about different things here. So if you want amazing results, start at age 7. No question. If you are starting at age 18, then it's question. I think one has to dial down one's aspirations. So, I mean, that's a difficult
Hmm.
topic
Yeah.
because people don't want that to be true. No, seriously don't
Yeah.
want that to be true.
Yeah. Okay. You criticized an article. You criticized Riemann in an article for being complicated with his signals and functions. Are schemas any less complicated to understand? So
Uh,
perhaps schemas can get, you spoke of variations of the Romanesca, perhaps as just as an example of the many variations of the Romanesca. A printer is not necessarily always scale degrees 4 3 2 1, but sometimes it's melodically. I mean, the printer, as you know, is as there could be many ways of a printer happening. So perhaps could schemas be also just as complicated?
sure, it's the coast of Norway problem. If you want to get close up to something and see it in all its richness, it's going to be fairly complicated. But what we're calling complications here are all straightforward. When you hear a variation, you could say it's complicated because there's lots more notes, but actually it's just as easy to perceive as the original in most cases. Riemann, on the other hand, was so complicated even Riemann got confused at times. I, I mean, trying to tell the difference between a dominant parallel accord and a dominant light tone Wechselklang is challenging at best. And it's worth pointing out that neo-Riemannian theory recast some of Riemann's terms so that they don't exactly mean what they meant in Riemann anymore. So it's conceptually complicated.
Hmm. Okay. Now, Roman numerals are criticized when describing harmony. However, you use numerals. I think you believe you use scale degrees to identify bass steps. Can you explain the omission of I guess root fundamentals and the priority of bass steps? Um, is there a loss perhaps if you don't put the fundamental chord in the analysis? Is there a because if you just put the scale degree of the bass note, perhaps there's some insight to having the fundamental chord at a more global view.
Well, it was Jean-Philippe Rameau's fondest hope that the fundamental bass thing would all work out. And about 5 times in his career, he tried to make sense out of the rule of the octave in terms of fundamental bass. And he failed every time. Okay. You know, music is a human creation with history rolling old things into new things all the time. And so it's really difficult to systematize it. Fundamental bass was an attempt. But interestingly enough, it wasn't an attempt to teach musicians. It was an attempt to impress the French Academy of Science. And that's where it was successful. And that's why the Paris Conservatory didn't adopt it. Because it has what Carl Dahlhaus called Systemzwang, a compulsion to systematize. You know, Rameau admired the gravity guy, the
Newton.
You know, Newton. Yeah, I mean, he quoted Newton. He thought that, you know, something like simple axioms would be able to describe harmony in the way that gravity described the, you know, motion of things and even planets. It was an unrequited dream. He tried his whole life to make it work out. Again, fundamental bass and bass motions and whatever. This is a theory for amateurs. And it's been tremendously successful that
Or
way.
perhaps very highfalutin scientists. Do you think it's to attract scientists, perhaps?
Yes. Well, unfortunately, a lot of work in music cognition has been based on a year of freshman harmony that somebody took on their way to a physics degree. So, you know, sometimes they're testing things that aren't that important.
Okay, and the last question. These are all great questions. Thank you to everyone who sent in the questions. What does your theory contribute for the understanding of cadences in modern tonality? Can a church organist learn from music schema?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, you know, the whole Partimento tradition, schemas and Partimenti, that was to train church organists. That's why they were there. You learn to improvise because you're going to spend the rest of your life improvising little versets and introits and whatever. It works today. I've been sitting at a church organ at times, and something will come up with what the minister is doing, and they'll kind of look at you like, you know, like they do on television sometimes, like, you know, they'll say, stretch, play me off. And you just start plugging in these patterns, and everybody in the congregation thinks that you're a genius because you can music just comes to you, you know. But you know, both in jazz and Partimento playing, the secret of improvisation is that it's never improvised. The only thing that's improvised is what pattern you choose next.
Yeah. Are you familiar with a research paper about Darwinian evolution applying to music schemata? It can be accessed on Google Scholar by searching up Galant Schemata.
This sounds vaguely familiar, but I'm sure I can't cite anything specific about it.
Okay. All right. And then let's go on to this one. What historical undercurrents in music, or even more general music, led to the assemblage of more and more semi-independent stock materials? Did this come out of basso continuo? So it's really a music history question. Did this incredible change see relevant parallels in practices other than music? You mentioned theater in your book. You wove in a lot of very interesting historical parallels. So just the second part of the question: does this also share any underlying causal relationship with the growing preference for sequence, or is it just considered a coincidence or a matter of speculation which cannot be substantiated?
Well, this is a very wise question and a devilish one because as Nathaniel suggested, it's very hard to substantiate anything in the distant past. I mean, we're not even sure there was a Shakespeare. So how can we be sure there was a Monteverdi? And separating correspondences from causality, that's quite difficult. There's no question that the 17th century went crazy for sequences. It's right there. They were all over the place. What we don't know is, were they always there and they only bubbled up to the written surface when a certain taste for a kind of instrumental music came along. In Palestrina's style of music gets written down. He's the Pope's head musician. So whatever he does gets archived. But maybe there was all kinds of sequential stuff going on there. In the early 16th century, there were things called frottole that were played during carnival season in Italy. And there you'll find things like montes and romanescas and lots of sequential patterns like that. You can even find them a little bit under the surface in the Roman sacred music of Victoria, Victoria was sort of like the drama queen compared to Palestrina. It's more dramatic music, or Lasso, to go even further in that direction. So you can find some sequences in their music. But it's a complex question, and it would take I'm not qualified.
A time machine. You would need a time machine.
Yes, and I'm not qualified to really answer it.
And this is actually good. You mentioned this almost at the beginning of the interview. Are there any materials available or in development that deal with schemas in modern music? You talked about the 2-5-1 in jazz. So he's asking, are any materials available or in development for modern or contemporary music? Can typical and recurring chord progressions used in jazz and pop music be legitimately classified as schemas? I think you answered that, as in the article Introduction to Harmonic Schemas in Pop Music, Open Music Theory.
Yeah, without question. I mean, if you know the changes for so-called rhythm changes, I've got rhythm. Okay, well, the break is a fonte. Okay, it's been serving the same purpose in minuets in the 18th century, or in pop music, or in jazz music. Some of these things are really perennials. I've had students. Take Elton John. He wrote 600 some songs, and he would dash off a song in 15 minutes. Well, that usually suggests that he has a repertory of schemas that he's plugging in. And sure enough, I don't know Elton John's whole repertory, but listening to a lecture that this student gave once, it was pretty obvious. Yes, he has certain things that he does over and over and over again. So for his mind, I would say he has a set of schemas of a particular type. Now, if we talk about all of rock music, then maybe we have to be more general. But certainly, yes.
I have a question. You said 2-5-1 is the schema, but there's no melodic element to that. There could be infinite melodic elements to 2-5-1. That's really the bass progression. So, like if we hear a popular song, it's often 1-5-6-4 nowadays. There's a lot of. Are they really schemas or chord progressions? Or are they the same thing?
Well, in the 18th century, what I wrote about originally, they're coming out of a contrapuntal tradition. The composers in Italy at that time were called contrapuntisti, counterpointers. They weren't called harmonisti. Okay. So it was only natural that I describe some of these schemas in two-part counterpoint with a little addendum as to what the harmony usually was. I think once we get into the world of jazz, sometimes just the chords are enough. But of course, you're still going to get the jazz players doing similar things, a keyboard player in their right hand. So, if it's a turnaround, and it's done quickly, there's only so many things that could do. I mean, if you're in Honolulu and you want to work in one of the hotels, you have to be able to go. Right? I mean,
And you would know because you were based there for a while, right?
Yeah, I was in the 25th Infantry Division in Hawaii. But I mean, it's a total cliche.
Yeah.
But cliches are schemas too. and in a way, to do popular ensemble music at the drop of a hat, you have to have some shared patterns that everybody knows. Mm-hmm. Now, I understand that for jazz players, they often think of it in terms of standards. Instead of saying a chord progression in particular, you can say, well, that's Cherokee, or that's, rhythm changes or something like that.
Mm-hmm. And the final question, and thank you so much, Professor Gjerdingen, for really being gracious with your time to answer these questions. This is a former student of yours. I've attended some of Professor Gjerdingen's classes on figure-based and schemata theory. These were mind-opening classes, to my understanding, much of his work. But to my understanding, much of his work on schemata theory came before his discovery of Partimento. My question is, how would these undergraduate theory classes been different had your discovery of Partimento literature occurred earlier?
Yes. I don't remember having any students named Agamemnon, but I'm very grateful that he enjoyed the time, or she enjoyed the time. I think I had one opportunity to teach Partimenti before I retired, and it was in a keyboard lab. And it was one of the most fun classes I had. I tried really hard to almost never speak. And it was just monkey see, monkey do. But you can't believe how successful that is. Seriously. I would go, and then the students, would go, and then I would go, and they would go, and then I would go, and they would go. And then the tricky part. We've now learned the circle of fifths. I mean, it's really that easy. I had one student at the end of 10 weeks went off to Amsterdam to enroll in a continual playing course at a high level. I was amazed. We make this stuff really hard in college courses. But at the end of the day, there's a beautiful simplicity that can be found. And if you can find that, it's really rewarding. It's a lot of fun. And
so you would have changed your theory class then to be more like that. Of course, you have to explain, right? Because it's a theory class, so you can't get away with not talking, though.
Well, as a senior faculty member, I was allowed to so-called waste a quarter of the student's time on something a little bit experimental. Trying to do that in basic theory courses would be really tough because everybody would fight you. The wind players would say, well, I'm going to have to pass the graduate placement exam at Eastman, so I have got to know 265 of 3. And there's a lot of institutional um, force that makes theory classes the way they are. I mean, there's 2,000 different schools teaching music theory, and there's hardly a whisper of a difference between any of them, as if there's total agreement that this is what needs to be done. I think the total agreement is this is what people can pass, even if they're untalented. And so it's very hard to get beyond that. I mean, there was a point at Northwestern where I said, look, this is a pretty high level conservatory. Can you really say that getting a C in the identification of triads is adequate to go on to a harmony class? What does that mean? That you get 65% right? You know? So I put through a series of so-called skills tests that you had to get 95% right in like 3 minutes before you could go on. I had students and one teacher crying in my office.
Mm.
They thought this was totally unfair. This was cruel. That there's no way they could ever do such a thing, to look at CEG and say that's a major triad that quickly. They thought that these were items of study and contemplation, like maybe that's an overnight assignment.
Yeah.
So yes, there are reasons that there's a line from Middlemarch, famous 19th century novel, that said that the first job of the minister in the church is to fill the church. And in the business of music departments, you might say the first job of a music department is to fill the department. And if you're really hardcore about skills, and it's going to be hard to fill the department.
Well, what do you think of Professor Job Agerman kind of scrapping the and using his harmony, counterpoint, and Partimento textbook instead, which I think is really good.
It's brilliant. He has the advantage of being an elite teacher. I mean, amazing teacher, and teaching elite students. The Conservatory of Amsterdam is one of the great conservatories on the continent, and it's especially known for its early music programs. I mean,
So the
I've
stars
heard
are aligned in that situation, but it's a little harder in North America.
I've heard groups somewhere on the internet. I hope it's there. Somewhere on the internet, you can find a quartet of his students improvising 4-part music on a thorough bass, and it's beautiful.
That's great.
I mean, they see a figured bass, and one will sing the bass. That's the easy part. But the other 3 are doing suspensions and resolutions and all the harmonies, and just gorgeous.
That's great.
So yeah, it was. I think it was impressively successful.
So the final question, and it's been really a pleasure to speak with you, Professor Gjerdingen. This was a subject of conversation that I thought was very interesting on Facebook at the Art of Partimento, which was a very good question. And there was a teacher who was asking about, we have this ABRSM. It's very popular around the world, where you take these graded exams 1 to 8. And we're not talking about university now. We're talking about really K through 12, essentially, where
I know.
primary 1 to junior college, secondary school. And I can speak for Singapore and a lot of the former British colonies. This is pretty much this, and Trinity and RCM, and they all have these exams, and it's pretty much the standard sort of performance-based curriculum where you memorize 3 pieces. You play them, you get a distinction or a merit, or pass or fail. There's a little 5 or 10% sight reading component. There's a little ear training component. But really, that's what essentially dominates testing for young children. And then they go to university, and it's a whole different ballgame. Or it might be even just a continuation if they're in a performance major. And somebody asked, why not we have some sort of Partimento-like testing? And just for myself, I think testing is wonderful. I don't like the current way it's just performance based. It would be kind of cool. I just think there's not enough teachers to really do the qualified testing. That's the big drawback. But if there were more teachers and there was some sort of standardization, it would be cool. Here, do book 2 for enrollee number 3. Can you do it? It's like a driving test. You can't do it, you fail. It's so simple. You can do it. If it's correct, you pass. You do a really good realization, it's a distinction. I like that idea because it's kind of it's a little bit more mainstream. But a lot of people were actually down on the idea. They did not like testing because, or they did not like this idea of it, and they were talking about the many pitfalls. I really sympathize with the person asking the question, of course, because it would be great if because all these moms who take their lessons, they want to see their certificate, they want to see the distinction, they don't care about all this high idealism, they don't care about it. So what do you think, Professor Gjerdingen? What do you think about testing for primary to secondary?
It's a big moneymaker for the ABRSM. I can see myself getting $20 for every gold star I stamp on a video. It's a really interesting idea. The problem, it would be like doing the same thing in jazz. It's who's going to judge, because there are different schools of this sort of thing. There's the Basel Schola Cantorum group. There's the Amsterdam group. They're the Italians, and they don't all do this stuff quite the same. I mean, it's an interesting idea, and
because what we have now is no good. We need something different.
No, I know. Alma Deutscher was an early Partimento player, and both on the keyboard and on violin. And she, a couple years ago now, I guess, she enrolled in the conducting program at the University of the Arts in Vienna, the former Hochschule. And there was an entrance exam in music analysis. And they said, well, you can do Roman numerals or Schenkerian analysis. And she said, well, I don't do any of that stuff. I do Gjerdingen schemas. And they said, oh, okay, well, go ahead. She's a star there now. So,
well, I'm glad they allowed her to do the different way of analysis.
Yes. I mean, now she's a special case. She's a person of amazing,
amazing talent. Yeah,
amazing talent. But no, it's an interesting idea. I think we're probably not at a stage where there's official versions of some of these things. I think it got rather like that in the early 19th century in Naples. I've looked at realizations of usually book 5 or 6 Fenaroli Partimenti by different Italian students at that time. They are so similar. I mean, I wonder if they didn't have cheat sheets, that they would circulate like the official realizations, and then they would just memorize.
See Giovanni around the back corner. He'll give you the mock exam answers.
But, it was the case that at the Paris Conservatory at the time of Claude Debussy and Maurice Ravel, there were 2 harmony classes. And the first was what we might call keyboard harmony. And some of the teachers, some of the masters, and some of the students referred to this as Partimento playing. They actually used the word Partimento, even though it had become archaic by that time. And one of Debussy's classmates mentioned that he got a first prize in Partimento, which is really surprising. This is in the 1880s, 1870s. But the second class, which was called just harmony, was really 4-part contrapuntal writing on given basses or melodies. But this first class, this applied harmony at the keyboard, that was graded. So they set a bass or a melody before the student, and the student played. They were figured, if the basses were figured somewhat. But then they were graded. But of course, the advantage is presumably the jury, did lots of students year after year, and so they probably were consistent. It would be hard to, just as a practical matter, it's hard to get consistent grading of things like that. But it's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, I mean, if they had an academic fugue, why not you have academic Partimento? I know people will be horrified at that because they all want endless idealistic creativity all the time. But I mean, just get the basics down and then just do it well. I mean, like, come on, if a grade 8 meant that somebody could do Fenaroli book 3 or 4, the Movimento book, and that's a good thing. I mean, that's great if somebody can give a stock valid solution. That's maybe you could have cheat sheets. I mean, probably what would happen is there'd be like 30 realizations of the same Partimento, but that's a good thing if someone memorizes 30 rows. That's like you're down as a child, you're downloading all these realizations. It's more information. How can that be a bad thing?
There's some sense that understanding something means to be able to respond appropriately. Okay. And especially for nonverbal things. If someone goes, and then the next person goes, I think we could agree that that person understood the first person, right?
Yeah.
And, when some of these child prodigies do this, it is kind of astounding. They are hearing a lot. They really are, and it's a nonverbal understanding, but it's an understanding all the same. And maybe in music, it's more important kind of understanding. I'm always impressed that people can do that kind of thing. But it would be wonderful, if only we could get children
more teachers. Oh, okay.
Yeah. But I mean, the trick is to start with children because they don't know it's difficult. They just learn it so quickly and so well.
Great. Well, the great Professor Robert O. Gjerdingen, I hope everyone enjoyed this Christmas music schema episode. We heard the Monte at the beginning, so I think that was very fitting. Let's do this like a radio. Professor Gjerdingen, why don't you take us out with a Monte?
Merry Christmas.